Good morning. We're going to finish up Lamentations today. I know it's been several weeks since our last lesson out of this text. I was going to finish it last week, and at some point in preparing for last Sunday, it just kind of came to be a realization that maybe Lamentations wasn't the best study material for Mother's Day, so I changed it up last week and postponed it one more week to today. So we're going to finish Lamentations, and if you don't remember the first four chapters, the first four poems actually, that's all right. I'm going to do a little bit at the end of kind of tying it all together so we can see the big picture of what's going on in this text. So here we've come to the final poem. As I mentioned in our introductory lesson, really this is about the only book in the Bible where I feel like the chapter divisions are perfectly correct. Because rather than chapters, it's more like five separate poems connected by the theme of suffering and sorrow and grief, as this is a point in time where Israel has been destroyed and Judah, the southern tribe, has been destroyed, and Jerusalem is in ruins. People have died because the city has been under siege for months on end. They have starved. Their buildings have been destroyed. The temple has been sacked. All of the treasures of the temple have been removed. Gentiles have entered the holy place and completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. We know in the book of Nehemiah, when he comes back 70 plus years later, we know the condition of the city. Everything has to be rebuilt, the walls, the temple. So this is a complete ruin, a complete destruction of their way of life. So poems 1 and 2 are pretty much similar in their composition, and we noted that they're all roughly equivalent as far as their makeup. The first four poems are an acrostic where each verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There's 22 characters in the Hebrew alphabet, so poems 1 and 2 are 22 verses. Each verse begins with the successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. We noted, though, that it seems to increase with intensity by the third poem. The first two poems are very dark and offer little hope, but the third poem is kind of a pinnacle, if you will, a mountain peak, where it builds up to this crescendo. And now it's a triple acrostic. There are 66 verses. They're each shorter, so it's not really that much longer, but 3 letters in a row. 3 of the letter A, 3 of the letter B, of course, in the Hebrew alphabet, but not English. So it kind of increases to a triple acrostic, and it offers that one glimpse of hope. You know, the one verse that everybody remembers from the book, great is thy faithfulness. Your mercies are new every morning. And so it kind of gives us, in the middle of all this grief and sorrow, this little glimpse of hope. And it builds in intensity. Then poem 4 is only 44 lines. So each verse is 2 lines, whereas in the first 2 poems, they were 3 lines. So poem 4, though it's still an acrostic, it's shorter. And now we come to poem 5, and it's only 22 lines. And it's not an acrostic. So all of the poetic style has kind of fallen apart. And my best explanation, I don't really know if it is Jeremiah who wrote this text. I don't know why we lose the acrostic theme, even though it's still 22 lines. But my guess is, emotionally, he's just running out of gas. He's just kind of exhausted at this point. And I think poem 5 represents kind of an understanding of the circumstances, a resignation to the pain and misery that's not going to go away, but an understanding of who God is and the hope that he has. So poem 5 is the shortest of all. I see a few people smiled or perked up when I said that. It's the shortest of all the poems. The acrostic theme is lost, and I think this is just kind of we build to a crescendo, and it just kind of goes out with a sigh, but I want to say this ends on a pretty good note. So the first 18 verses, what I want to do is just read through the first 18 verses and point out that what Jeremiah is calling upon God to do is to remember them. And I don't believe this is the idea, and we see this right away from verse 1. Remember. Does God need to be reminded? That's the very first verse. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. Do you think God has forgotten? That he's got a short memory and doesn't remember these things, or that Jeremiah just wrote these 4 poems before and said, in case you've forgotten what I just got done saying, God, I'm going to remind you, I want you to remember these things. No, God does not need a reminder. He doesn't forget these things. I want to point out to you what's really going on here is not that God needs to be reminded, not that we have to say, God, don't forget. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 11, Jesus is teaching us how to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. We get to the end of the chapter, just a few breaths later in this sermon, and Jesus says, oh, by the way, your Father already knows what you need before you even ask him. So why do we bother to ask God? You already know what we need. Why do we have to ask you? It's not that God needs a reminder. It's that in doing so, it's that in asking for God's blessings, it puts us in the position of dependence. It shows our faith and trust and reliance upon him. So it's not that God needs a reminder. What's going on here, when now we turn to the first 18 verses, is that Jeremiah, kind of praying for and praying with, if you will, the nation of Judah, is asking God to remember your promises. We're putting ourselves in complete trust and reliance on you. We got nothing else. I think that's why Poem 5 loses the acrostic theme and is so short compared to the other 4 poems, because it's kind of a resignation to, we've got nothing. We've lost everything that we thought was special, the temple, the city, most of our people. We got nothing left. God, you are it. Please remember us, because if you don't remember us, if you forget your covenant, your promises made to us, we have nothing else left. So this is Jeremiah putting his complete dependence and reliance upon God. Not that God forgot, but it's a matter of saying, God, you're our only hope. You're our last hope. You are all that we have. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our house to aliens. We have become orphans without father. Our mothers are like widows. We have to pay for our drinking water. Our wood comes to us at a price. They've lost a lot of their basic liberties and quality of life. They can't even take care of their own needs right now. Food, shelter, clothing, they can't even provide that. They have to turn to other nations. In fact, that's what he's going to say in verse 6. We have submitted to Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. A little bit ironic, because that's part of what got them in this mess. Years before these events of their destruction, they were looking to people in nations like Egypt and Assyria, making deals with them for protection, buying security from them, and God says, you should have come to me all along. So it's a little bit ironic that now they have to turn to these nations just for basic necessities. They should have trusted God from the very beginning. Verse 5, this is pretty important to me, I think, and I think it's pretty significant to Judah. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are worn out. There is no rest for us. I made mention of that in the first poem, how significant the idea of rest is. Rest is really what the land represented. And now that the nation is taken away from them, now their cities are destroyed, they're going to be taken away as captives. They've lost their rest, their security, their comfort, their peace of mind. They have no more rest. And when you sin, and that, I love the book of Lamentations. I have never really studied it in depth until presenting these lessons. I've read through it a couple of times and done a few studies, but I've always failed to appreciate it until this time. I realize this is not a fun book to read, but I am so thankful that it's here, that God is telling me this is the ugliness of sin. This is what it does to your life. This is how it affects our relationship. And I'm thankful that it's in this book to tell me these things and warn me not to make the same mistakes they did. Because when you sin, when you reject God, your rest is gone. Now, we're not having our nation, our physical country taken away from us necessarily. But if you look in Philippians chapter 4, Jesus makes these promises that he'll give us peace, that he'll give us a comfort in him. I mean, ultimately, you could think of this as heaven. In the book of Hebrews, it talks about how there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. We kind of think of that as heaven. So certainly if you sin, you lose that ultimate rest, that Sabbath to which we should be looking forward to. But in Philippians chapter 4, many times, like on the Sermon on the Mount, do not be anxious for tomorrow. Time and time again, God is telling us, I want to give you peace. I want to give you comfort. Your circumstances in life might be challenging. On the outside, you might be suffering, but I'm going to give you rest in your soul. I'm going to give you peace that overcomes whatever trials this life gives at you. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Be anxious for nothing. And that's always one of those, sure, it's just that easy, right? But this is God telling you, if you really buy into me, if you really devote yourself to me and really believe and have faith and follow where I lead you, it is just that easy. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And when you sin, you lose that rest, you lose that peace, you lose that security, and I'm talking spiritual. No matter what happens, whether it's relationship issues, family issues, health issues, things going on around you in the world, events that you can't control. When you're right with God, you can overcome that stuff because you know my soul is safe. You know that heaven is a guarantee. But when you sin, you lose that safety. You lose that peace. You lose that rest. So we go back to Lamentations. I thought that was worth pointing out in verse 5. They've lost their rest. That was huge to them. When they lost the land, when they lost God, they lost their rest. Moving on in verse 7, our fathers sinned and are no more. It is we who have borne their iniquities. Now, he's not necessarily trying to pass the buck here or shift the blame and saying it's not our fault this has happened. All throughout chapter 1 and verse 8, all throughout this book, he's been confessing we're to blame for this. Chapter 1 and verse 8, Jerusalem sinned greatly, therefore she has become an unclean thing. He's admitting their guilt right there in essentially every chapter. 2 and verse 14, your prophets have seen you for false and foolish visions, and they have not exposed your iniquity so as to restore you from captivity, but they have seen for you false and misleading oracles. Said, we have sinned, and our prophets have failed to challenge us, to confront us about our sin. They've kind of whitewashed over it. So all throughout these poems, he is admitting their guilt. Even in this very poem, look at verse 16. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. He's not trying to shift the blame in verse 7 by saying it's our parents' fault, but he is acknowledging that, the axe of destruction should have fallen generations ago, but God in his mercy has allowed us time, and we haven't done any better. And that tells us, that's a warning for those of us with children, for those looking at the younger generations. If we live sinful, it will impact them as well. They aren't suffering because their parents sinned necessarily. They're suffering because their parents sinned and didn't teach them to do any better, and they sinned as well. Kind of generational consequences passing on this lack of responsibility before God. But that's what's going on here. And so kind of finishing out, he just describes again, verse 9, we get our bread at the risk of our lives. Verse 10, our skin has become as hot as an oven because of the burning heat of famine. They've ravished the women in Zion, the virgins in the city of Judah. Princes were hung by their hands. Elders are not respected. Young men worked at the grinding mill, and youth stumble under loads of wood. Elders are gone from the gate. And that was critical. That means there's no more justice. There's no more equity. That's the purpose, the function that elders served in the gates. We're destroyed. Again, verse 15, the joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned into mourning. Verse 14, young men from their music. Music is something you do when you're happy. There's no more of that. They have no more joy. We're completely destroyed. Woe to us, for we have sinned. He's acknowledging their guilt. And again, he says, God, remember. Remember your promises, because we have nothing left. Everything's been taken away. By the way, go back to Deuteronomy 28. That's a pretty long chapter, 60 plus verses. But you'll see that everything he talks about here in this chapter, every bad thing that has happened to them was foretold in Deuteronomy 28. Everything. God was very specific in his warning. Said, this is exactly what I'm going to do if you don't listen to me, if you don't keep this covenant. And everything God said would happen, happened. And now they're saying that's all taken away, our covenant with you, everything that made us special, everything that made us something unique, anything that gave us joy and a reason to sing is gone. And God, we have nothing left but you, and our hope is in your faithfulness to keep your word. 2 Samuel chapter 7. There are a lot of scriptures we could go to. You could go read all of, Exodus and Deuteronomy and read the law and Leviticus and see all the promises that God made there, part of the covenant agreement. But I think 2 Samuel is pretty fitting. 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 13. These are promises made to David. 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 13, saying, a descendant of David shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. They knew these promises that God had made, and that's what they're saying. God, remember. See all that has happened to us. See all that we have lost. And we got nothing left but to remember your covenant and your promises, that you would restore this kingdom, and we come to you broken. I got my 2 points there mixed up. I apologize for the note takers. I hope you can keep up before I move to the next, but there is a printed handout today. But that's what's going on in these first 18 verses. He's just saying, remember, God. You don't need to be reminded, you haven't forgotten, but we have nothing else but to call on you and hope in your faithfulness. And that's reassuring to me that when God makes promises to us, again, it's not that we're trying to hold him hostage or make demands. God, you promised, and it doesn't matter how horrible a person I am, you promised you do this, so you owe it to me. That's not the attitude here. But there is this dependence, this reliance upon God and his faithfulness. I will never forsake you, I will never depart you. We can call upon God in prayer and say, remember that promise, God. I've got nothing else, and I need you to be faithful, and I need to depend on your faithfulness to keep that word. He won't tempt us beyond what we're able, but he will provide us a way of escape. God has promised us that. God, remember, I've got nothing else. I can't fix this. I cannot solve this problem. I cannot dig myself out of this hole. So God, I'm calling upon you to remember. I have not been faithful, but I know you are faithful. That's what's going on in this last poem. Again, we might think of this as a prayer. And then we get to this beautiful image in the last couple of verses here. And I think this is really the key. This prayer doesn't make sense without what's said in verse 19. Thou, O Lord, dost rule forever. Thy throne is from generation to generation. God reigns. And that's an important thought. No matter what's happening in the world, no matter what's happening in your life, this should be part of our prayer. This should be part of our ever-present thought. God reigns. Yes, I might have trouble. I might have lost a job. I might be looking for a job. I might have some family issues with my children, with my parents, with my spouse. Some relationship issues. I might have some health issues. I might be looking at pretty significant diagnosis. The world is falling apart around us. I don't like the guy that's president. No matter what's going on, God reigns. God is on the throne. No matter how dark things are, this is the thought that keeps us going. When we have lost everything else, like Jeremiah and the city of Jerusalem, we remember that God is on his throne. And this is a common image. Luke chapter 18. I'm going to come back to this at the end of the lesson, but I just want to draw your attention to Luke chapter 18. We know Luke chapter 18, verse 9, Jesus tells us why he's giving them this parable. In Luke chapter 18, verse 9, he also told them this parable to certain ones who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. And we know how the story goes. You got a tax collector and a Pharisee, and the Pharisee there is just kind of saying, I'm glad I'm not like this loser over here, this spiritual nobody. I fast and I tithe and I'm such a good person, God, and you're lucky to have me on your team. He told this parable to certain ones who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. That's what got Israel, that's what got Judah into this mess, where now Jerusalem is a pile of ruins and ashes, because they trusted in their own righteousness, not in God. Now, in their grief, and after some reflection, they can acknowledge, God, it's up to you now. It's not about us. It's not about depending on ourselves. They have resigned themselves and finally understand this concept that it's up to God in his mercy to take action and save them. God reigns. He is in control. We are not. We trust and rely upon him. That's the image of what's going on in these final couple of verses here. And no matter what, God is on the throne. This is a great image that's all throughout the Bible. Think of Isaiah chapter 6. We're going to get to this soon in our study. Isaiah spoke during pretty perilous times. Isaiah saw the northern 10 tribes of Israel completely destroyed by Assyria. Then Assyria turns and heads south, and they all but conquer the tribe of Judah. And they're there laying siege to the city of Jerusalem for months on end. Pretty dire circumstances. Isaiah chapter 6. As Isaiah is called to be a prophet, what's the first thing that he sees and records? Isaiah chapter 6. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. In perilous times, that's what Israel needed to be reminded of. God is on the throne. The prophet Ezekiel begins his book with a description. No, it's not a flying saucer and aliens the way some weird people think Ezekiel is describing. He's describing God on his throne. The whole first chapter, that's how Ezekiel's book begins. Again, Ezekiel's talking to people who have been destroyed, who have been taken away as captives. Pretty dark, pretty devastating. Imagine them. What is going through their minds as they're sitting as prisoners in Babylon? All is lost. There is no hope. Ezekiel comes along and says, I saw a vision of God on his throne. He's still in control. No matter what circumstances, God can work it to your spiritual benefit. He is still on the throne. Revelation chapter 4, we know that book is about Christians who are suffering and are about to suffer with even greater intensity. Revelation chapter 4 is beautiful description, even into chapter 5, of God on his throne before a sea of glass. No turbulence. It's all smooth. It's all peace. God is in control, and there's no question about it. So this is what he's getting to at the end, his final conclusion. You can kind of see what's going on here. God, remember, because we have nothing left. We've lost it all. We're counting on you to be faithful, God. That's our hope. And God, we know that you are still on the throne. We know that no matter how bad things are right now in our distress, you are still on the throne. And we can still count on you. But he comes with this final thought in verse 22. Let me read verse 22. Unless thou hast utterly rejected us and art exceedingly angry with us. It says, renew us as the days of old. Fix us, rescue us, save us. Unless you're angry with us still. Unless you're angry with us forever. And that's the end. Does that seem like a downer? Kind of a depressing way to end this series of poems? I think there's a little hopefulness in this, because I think this is a recognition. God, you're within your rights to still be angry with us. There's humility there. There's a broken and a contrite heart in that verse. That's why this is such a great prayer. In the face of sin, in the face of their own sinfulness and suffering the consequences of their sin, I love the brokenness of this last verse. We acknowledge, God, that you'd be within your right to just let us suffer more. We don't deserve it. They were counting on God's dependence. But I want to tell you something too. Have you ever known God in the face of true repentance to remain angry? Yes, I think they acknowledge their brokenness and that they aren't worthy. They don't deserve to be rescued by God. But they're showing a broken and a contrite heart. And God, that's the sacrifice he wants. There's a progression here in this book I want to share with you. I mentioned early on in one of the lessons in Romans chapter 8 and verse 26, there's kind of a progression here. Did you ever notice that in this book, God doesn't speak directly? God never intervenes like he does with Job and says, hold on now, who are you to ask such questions? No, he lets his actions do the talking. He lets what he said hundreds of years earlier in Deuteronomy do the talking. The words, the law he gave, he lets it stand. And he says, Jeremiah, I'm going to allow you the freedom to work through this yourself. And I see a progression in poems 1 through 5. It's kind of funny. My dad preached a sermon on this a couple weeks ago. He did the whole book of Lamentations in one sermon. It was about an hour long. It was, had to make a lot of cuts to it and didn't get as in-depth as I have, spreading it out over 6 lessons. But my dad started that lesson and put it together because he heard the first 3 or 4 sermons I did on Lamentations. And then he was kind of upset that I didn't finish the book quickly. He's like, I was hoping to hear your conclusion. So I got to listen to my dad's, and now it's kind of funny. I got him started, but he got me thinking about this progression, seeing him do it all in one lesson. I see a change. This is Jeremiah working his way through this, trying to grasp it, trying to understand it, and God just letting him. Romans chapter 8 and verse 26 is very comforting to me. And in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness. For we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. We don't always know what we're supposed to say before God. Sometimes it's groanings too deep for words. Sometimes it's emotion. We don't even know how we feel about something and how to put that into words. And God says, that's where the Holy Spirit helps you. You don't always know. Prayers aren't always pretty. Maybe they aren't always the right things to say. But that's okay. God wants us to pour out our heart before him, good and bad, ugly and pretty. And that's what I see. In Lamentations 1, it kind of begins with this, constant reminder of there's no one to comfort me, God. I've lost everything. All hope is gone. No one is here to comfort me. All hope is lost. In poem 2, it seems like Jeremiah is almost even accusing God of, you've gone too far. This is too much. This punishment is too great. Chapter 2 and verse 20. Notice what he says there. See, O Lord, and look. He says, look at what you've done. With whom hast thou dealt thus? Should women eat their offspring, the little ones who are born healthy? Should priest and prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? He says, look who you've done this to. It's us. It's your people. Should this happen? He's kind of questioning God. Poem 3, of course, we know the words beginning in verse 19. Said, I reminded myself, I forced myself to remember certain truths. He's kind of saying, I used my brain. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindness indeed never cease, and his compassions never fail. Great is thy faithfulness. He says, let me try to snap myself out of this. Maybe I overstepped my bounds. I shouldn't have questioned God. I know we sinned and we brought this on ourselves, but God, this seems harsh. But let me remind myself, God keeps his promises. He is faithful. And in that momentary thought, he found a little glimpse of hope. And then we get to chapter 4. And in verse 13, kind of emphasizes, because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who have shed in her midst the blood of the righteous. It's kind of saying, because, this is the reason why. Chapter 4 is kind of a time where he starts to analyze, okay, why has this really happened? So you can kind of see this change of wrestling with emotion and grief and sorrow. There's no one to comfort me, and God, how could you do this? But I remember, you are faithful. And when I think about it, I understand it is our fault. And so we get to poem 5, and here's resignation. Okay, God, it's in your hands. Everything is in your hands. We sinned, and you are faithful. You punished us according to your word, and now our hope is in you to be faithful to restore us. And that's kind of a progression I see through Jeremiah, as God just sits back and allows him to struggle at times, wrestle with his emotions, then to have some rational thought and analyze what's going on, and to come to this conclusion. This final question, unless you are utterly rejecting us, completely rejecting us, and are still angry with us, this final question, I think, shows how Jeremiah, and speaking for the people of Judah, they finally acknowledge their brokenness before God. They don't seem too hopeful on the surface, yet I think they're an expression of their acceptance of their guilt and their total dependence. I mentioned Luke chapter 18, and we read a little bit. You got the Pharisee, Lord, I'm glad I'm not like this loser over here. But what did the tax collector say? He wasn't even willing to look up to heaven, to lift up his gaze to God. All he could say is, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Do you see the same thought there? Unless you're still angry with us, unless you're going to utterly reject us. That's not even being willing to look up at God. It's an acknowledgement of their complete sinfulness before God. It's just like that beautiful prayer in Luke 18, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. The answer to this question is, of course, God will not remain angry with them forever because they're showing a brokenness and a dependence on God that he will not reject. Psalm 51 and verse 17, the great Psalm of David. And by the way, there's a lot of poems in the Psalms about God on his throne, in addition to the ones we looked at. But Psalm 51 and verse 17, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. They are showing their brokenness. We need you, God. We need you. We have nothing. We have no ground to stand on before you. In our meetup study on Tuesday, we're going through the Gospel of Mark, and we had some great discussion on what Jesus said there in Mark chapter 2 and verse 17. In Levi, the tax collector's house. And all the Pharisees, all the Jewish people, the leadership, the hypocrites, they would go to Jesus' disciples and said, why does your master hang out and eat with these people over here? They're sinners. And Jesus looks at them and says, that's right. They're the sick. It's the sick who need a physician, not those who are well. I didn't come to call the righteous. Jesus wasn't saying they were actually righteous. He meant self-righteous. Who goes to see a doctor? Someone who acknowledges that they're sick, and someone who acknowledges they are sick beyond their own ability to cure. I went to a doctor for the first time in like 9 years because I've been sick for over a month. I don't go to a doctor because sometimes I don't want to think I'm sick. And even when I'm sick, sometimes I'll just sleep it off, or I'll get over it on my own. I don't need to go to a doctor. Even when I recognize I'm sick, I'm like, I'm fine. The people who go to a doctor are those who recognize they are sick and admit that, and recognize they are broken beyond their ability to repair. That's why the answer to this question, unless you're angry with us forever, the answer is no. Because they're showing a brokenness. They're acknowledging, we're dead. We're broken. We're sick. And we can't fix ourselves. God, we need you. Beautiful prayer. I want to tie this into an invitation as we prepare to sing number 814. If you are one here this morning that acknowledges your brokenness, your sickness spiritually before God, said, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's the very first thing he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Those who acknowledge their brokenness and their spiritual poverty before God. If that's you this morning, you get the same answer to Jeremiah's question. No, God will not reject you forever. He'll welcome you back because you are showing a broken and a contrite heart, and those are the sacrifices he really wants. If that's you this morning, if we can help you, encourage you, pray with you, teach you more about Christ, whatever your need is, please come forward now as we stand and sing.